speaker, I just was just talking to him, the guy from TELUS, the CSO of TELUS, right? He, because his name is Vern, and I said, it's funny, people used to always call me Vern, right? Because my last name is Vernon, and so that was one of my nicknames. And then I was just chatting with some colleagues earlier about another nickname, which was Rico, and then I won't tell you all the other things that I've been called over the years, but certainly, we at Splunk, we like to talk about our million data points. So this is something that many people of Splunk, if you've seen other Splunk presentations, you'll hear my colleagues talk about their million data points. But of course, today we're here to talk about security. So first of all, welcome. My name is Chris Vernon, as you can see. I am a senior sales engineer with Splunk, based here in Vancouver. And so on the agenda for today, we're going to be looking at security operations centers, or SOCs. And now, as you would have heard in many presentations today, and I think as everyone who reads the news, watches the news is aware, of course, there's all kinds of breaches happening. The breaches keep happening. So why do they keep happening? And what can be done so that if you do have a security operations center, what can be done to help improve it so that it lives up to its promise? And now at Splunk, our overarching mission is to help our customers turn data into business outcomes. So as a result, we end up speaking to all kinds of different organizations. We talk to all kinds of different teams. We talk to IT teams. We talk to application development teams. And something like 40-50% of our business comes from security. So naturally, we talk to all kinds of different security teams out there, and as a result, we end up getting exposed to all kinds of variation of maturity levels with security. So today's much of the content that I'm going to be presenting today comes not only from my own personal experience, but as well some of this comes from experience of several of my colleagues. So I did just want to put out a quick shout out. I don't know if anyone here read the book Crafting the InfoSec Playbook. Anyone? Yeah, and I didn't intend to come here and plug it, but this is co-authored by Matthew Valletti's. He's actually no longer with Splunk. I think he went back to Cisco. But just to point out that he is he's provided a great source of content, as well as another colleague whose name is Dimitri McKay. He is a security architect with Splunk, and he's very well known for his affinity for Marvel characters. So if you do ever get a chance to see one of his presentations, it's all it's all very superhero-like. So it's it's a lot of fun. Now I do need to put up the usual caveat that just in case I make any kind of forward-looking statements, don't go and make investments or buy products based on forward-looking statements. Okay. So first of all, right, if we take a step back and consider where are we today? Now I feel like I've had a slide like this, or I've seen slides like this over the last 10, 15 years or so. Right? We are. I think everyone in this industry is very well aware of how breaches occur, right? With the mechanics of working through an attack, and so on, right? There's usually someone. There's a phishing message that the attacker tries to entice the victim into clicking on a link. They download say a PDF file or maybe a Word document, and then the victim's machine gets infected, of course, and maybe there's some communication back to a command and control server, or depending on the objective, maybe there's lateral movement and account compromise and so on. So of course we all know this very well, and the MITRE ATT&CK framework does such a fantastic job of mapping out all of those different tactics and techniques, right? So it's all very much known. As well, if you look at something like the Verizon's data breach investigations report. They've done such a fantastic job every year of bringing all of that breach data and that incident data together and summarizing it. And so in that Verizon report, they talk about how security is kind of similar to golfing. in the sense that it's kind of like a golfer is kind of like an attacker who's working his or her way down, working their way through your network is the same as like a golfer working their way down the fairway, right? So you as the defender are putting up sand traps and water features and so on, and from the attacker's point of view, well they have their trusted methods for teeing off, like social engineering. And when they get further down through the attack, then they reach for their trusty 7-iron, and that's kind of like using malware, right? So there's some interesting analogies there, and I'm not going to go into all the detail here. Again, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this today, but again, fundamentally, we know this is a big problem, right? And we know how it's happening. So we know the tools, the techniques, the tactics, and so on. And you look at Forrester, you look at Ponemon, and so on, and we see that a third of breaches involve insider or internal actors. There's a quarter of breaches are motivated by espionage, and of course, the total amount of damages is just it's growing every year. So, I think all of this can kind of be summarized in this manner, right? Is that this is where we're at. It just keeps happening. We all know about it. We know what's happening. We kind of know. Well, we mostly know what's happening. We know where. We know the who sometimes, and we certainly know the hows. But why, right? So why does it keep happening if we know all of this? And in many ways, it comes down to a question of resources, right? So I don't think anyone here is going to say, "Oh, I've got all the budget in the world that I need. I've got all the people that I need, and so on," right? So everyone's working off limited budget, limited resources, and of course the bad guys on the other side of the fence. Well, you look at organized crime, you look at nation-state adversaries, and they, of course, are so very well resourced, right? And they're going up against you. And this, of course, means that we all need to work smarter, not harder. And there is even this fun fact out there that something like 50% of organizations don't even have a security operations center at all. And then, of course, the ones that do have a SOC, often the security program can be quite immature, or sometimes we'll see cases where there's a fair amount of security theater, right? So there's they'll have the TV screens up on the walls, and there's some nice looking graphics, and right, everything looks great. But when you start to dig in a little bit more and you ask, okay, well, what are the metrics that you're measuring against? Well, often they're looking at things like number of cases closed. Right? But they're not actually properly measuring the risk that's reduced through their security program. And we also find that so many security teams out there are using a lot of manual processes as well. Okay, so again, if we take a step back here and think, okay, well, so what is a SOC, right? So a security operations center, ideally, right, is all about having that centralized unit that deals with security issues on an organizational and technical level, right? So it makes a lot of sense in theory, right? You have the people, you have the process, you have the technology. So again, in theory, right, you bring all of these alerts, all of these, all the information from all of the shiny security products that you've acquired, and you bring that all into one place. And then you have this alert queue. And then, of course, you have your shiny, happy tier 1 people. And they work, they easily work through all of the alerts. And the ones that are more difficult, they escalate those to the shiny, happy tier 2 people. And then the tier 3 guys, right? Your elite ninja staff, elite ninja pirate staff, they are the ones, of course, who have the capabilities to be proactive and do threat hunting. So they come up with a hypothesis and they look for sort of indicators of compromise on the network, all with a view to getting ahead of the adversary. And then, of course, you have your incident response team, which, as soon as something happens, right, they're all ready to kick into gear. They have their playbooks ready, and boom, right? They kick into action, everything works. It's a well-oiled machine, right? Life is golden. But we all know that this is not how it really is, right? So in reality, what happens is that, well, you stop to think about how this is working. You have an alert that goes off. You have a tier 1 analyst that looks at it, and of course they tend to be quite junior. But in any case, it can take them a good 25-30 minutes on average to work through a case. And I think it's Gartner that says the average analyst can work through something like 28 cases within an 8-hour shift. Right? So what happens is that, okay, these guys are starting to get overloaded with the alerts, and more and more of these alerts and cases go no one's looking at them, and they start to pile up, right? So the reality is that you end up with this kind of situation. You have the alert queue, you have your shiny, happy tier 1 folks, right? And they're all rearing to go, and they're out of university, and but then you present them with this wall of red, and they're all looking at that, and quite often, we see cases where they're spending all their time creating reports. They're not actually doing a lot of analysis. Or as well, we often find that that's a tough job, right? And maybe it's not living up to the dream they had of working in cybersecurity, or even the tech world. So what we find is that they start to get bored, and they go off and they become a developer, or maybe join some other part of the IT team, and so there tends to be quite high turnover, right? But they're dealing with thousands and thousands of those alerts, and then of course they escalate the difficult ones, and those wind up with the tier 2 guys. And there's hundreds of those escalated alerts that they all have to deal with. And then, your pirate, ninja, tier 3 guys, they're also overloaded, right? So they're dealing with tens of these very complicated incidents. They don't have time to go and do threat hunting, right? So they don't have time to go and be proactive and look for the bad stuff. And then the incident response team, well, they just don't exist, or there's no playbook and so on, right? So that's kind of the situation, or often it's even worse than that. So I think we all, we've all seen how quickly these breaches can happen, right? How quickly an infection can occur, and again, you look back and you say, oh, well, actually, in aggregate, for the whole industry, it's only something like 4% of alerts get investigated, right? So it's a pretty nasty situation. And then you add this other complicating factor, that the fact that there's a 0% unemployment rate for security professionals, and you hear about these numbers like there's 3.5 million, there will be 3.5 million unfulfilled security jobs next year, and it's a tough situation. So how do we get back to basics here, right? How do we get to that fully balanced SOC? And what I'm going to do here is break it down by security program, as well as people, process, and technology. So security program maturity, this is a conversation that we often have with customers, and because it's important for us to understand where they are within this maturity curve. And so what we see is that we can kind of classify the organizations we talk to into roughly 3 groups. So phase 1, this is where the first thing we see is they understand, oh, hey, security is important, this is a problem, and let's go out and buy a bunch of shiny technology boxes, right? And so they go and buy the technology, but then they soon quickly discover that hasn't fixed the security problem, because you need people. You need someone to go configure it, and of course maintain it and so on. So at this point, what we see is that they'll often get people to do double duty, often IT staff, or sometimes developers. So they've added in more people, and also at this point we see MSSPs being considered typically, but in general, as far as process goes, we don't see there isn't really a lot of proper security analysis at this point. It's all about building and maintaining tools and so on. So the next thing that happens is of course, as we see an organization progress, we find that they then start to outgrow the tools they acquired. And they find that they're not getting full value out of the promise of those security products, right? Or they find that the one they acquired wasn't right for them. Or they'll end up with overlapping tools and so on. And again, much of this comes down to the people factor. So we see them going out and buying better technology. And at this point, they find that, well, they need to have dedicated security staff. And so this is where we start to see the tiered sort of analyst structure start to develop. And then the more mature customers that we see, well, they then start to realize that, or they go through much more rigorous sort of tool consolidation in terms of getting rid of old technology, getting rid of freeware. And sometimes if they do have a managed service provider, they'll often bring it in-house at this point. In terms of people, they start to look at getting specialists in-house, so having malware experts, having threat intel experts. And because they went through that process or they've labeled or they've narrowed down their processes and written them down, it's at this point that they can start to get into automation. Now, another nice, this kind of great slide that I like, you can actually find, I think this is on GitHub. So this is kind of an open source diagram here. And this is useful for understanding where you are on the maturity curve, right? So if you read through some of these questions, right, these are good questions to ask yourself, right? So starting at the bottom, can you name the assets that you are defending? Do you have visibility across your assets? Can you detect unauthorized activity, and so on? And what we find is that the kind of phase one customers we see tend to sit at the bottom of the pyramid. Of course, phase two tend to sit kind of in the middle here. And it's really the most advanced, mature customers that we see who are actually doing proper threat hunting, right? So I know it's a very, it's a sexy topic, right? Everyone likes to hear about, oh yeah, threat hunting. It's cool, going after the tiger on the network. But the reality is that you need to have everything else in place and the processes and so on to actually do that properly. I didn't mention that. Yeah, this pyramid structure. So this is kind of modeled after Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, if you're going to start a security program today, what we typically recommend is starting off with a charter. And so what a charter is it's really an essential document for defining the scope and purpose of security. And what we often see is we'll see organizations who think, okay, I've got a security problem, I'm going to do everything under the sun to fix it. And what happens is that they end up biting off more than they can chew, right? They try to boil the ocean, and what happens is that ends up being a good way to fail slowly. So the great thing about a charter is that you can keep it small, and then you can expand out from there. And then as well, it's helpful for measuring yourself, against what you have on that. Oh, whoops. Yeah. People. Now, on the people front, right, the easy answer is hire smart people. And this is, of course, very much easier said than done. As we heard, with the 0% unemployment rate for security professionals. So this is difficult, right? This is very tough, and you don't need to start with 100% veterans, but of course the veterans are important. And one area that often gets overlooked is soft skills. So, I think we all know the kind of typical, tech guy story, tech guy situation where, he's kind of gruff and he kind of grunts, and he, doesn't write anything down, has all this tribal knowledge, but he's also the sage, right? So and he's the guru, right? Or he or she, and so everyone has to go to them for information. So it's, if you're looking at who to hire, well, and if you are looking at the junior guys, well, it makes sense to get people with soft skills, right? People who are curious and creative and are motivated and have critical thinking. But of course, the senior people are the cornerstone of any security program. There's this idea of hinky that Bruce Schneier talks about, and my understanding is that it came from an incident at the U.S. border here years ago, where there was a traveler. He had answered all the questions correctly by the border guard, but there was something still a little bit off. And that border guard later described, or actually they ended up stopping an incident because of that. But the border guard later said that the guy was acting hinky. And so it's this idea that senior guys have or senior people, right? They have the experience, and they can go and look at a log and say, there's something just not right there, right? And of course they're so crucial in terms of passing on that understanding to the junior folks. But of course, the junior staff, obviously very important. They're up to date on the latest coding techniques, and typically excited to learn, and so on. Now again, this idea that is the unemployment rate is 0%. People are very hard to find. So what can you do, right? Well, you find the smart people, and then you train them. Because this has come up before, where I've talked to junior staff, and I said, well, have you considered, I don't know, such and such course, or what are you doing training wise? And they're like, oh, they're not getting the backing necessarily from their organization. So I'm not in any way connected with SANS, and neither are my colleagues. But what we did was just put together an example of what a training journey could look like for security staff, right? So and of course there's all kinds of different vendors offering security training. But if you had some junior staff, you might want to consider some of these SANS courses. Starting out with security essentials, hacker tools, and for the more mid-range staff, managing security operations, continuous monitoring. And for the most advanced staff, look at malware analysis, cyber threat intelligence, of course. Okay, so at this point, right, you've hired your smart people, you have your kick-ass team together, but the reality is that, right, the bad guys have a lot of resources. So you need to obviously work with all kinds of different teams out there. Right? So if there's a breach, obviously you need to maybe work with legal, work with communications, PR, and so on, and you need to have a cadence with those teams, and you need to understand who's going to provide the data, right? And often we see people thinking, okay, well, security data, that's going to be my firewalls, my IDS, IPS system, and so on, which is those are all great data sources, but also, think of other data sources like physical security, right? So the badge readers, and we've seen some very interesting cases with customers where they've correlated data from the badge reader with the login information, within the office, right? Because all of a sudden you can figure out if someone's tailgating into the office, right? Or if they're pretending that they went into the office and they're actually remotely logging in from home or something like that. Right, so there's a lot there's a lot of value you can get in terms of understanding user behavior from combining non-traditional data sources. And just a quick word on funding. Now we often see that some of the most successful security programs we've seen, they started out by getting funding from, say, the risk and compliance team. They've also made use of help from IT teams and app development teams as well, to help pay for the security program, because at the end of the day, security is everyone's problem. Okay, so in terms of process, let's talk a little bit about process. Now this is always a kind of a fun graphic, and what this is that this is a show of some 400 different AMI types for Linux that are available on AWS, right? And this is, of course, right, the beauty of the modern age, is having so much choice. When it comes to a security policy, then defining standards is of course so very critical, right? Define OS, which OSs are okay, which versions are okay. Define your BYOD process, and also ask yourself what's okay. Is it okay if corporate staff use an external DNS server? Is it okay if they use a file sharing application on their network? Port scanning, right? What's acceptable use? So define standards and let them evolve over time. And now of course, the best laid plans of mice and men, right? Everyone needs to prepare for the inevitable, right? And this is where a lot of folks don't start with the end in mind, but it makes for quite an interesting mental exercise, right? So, if you get that call from Brian Krebs, right? So I didn't actually know he was calling people. That was new to me. But if you start out thinking, Krebs calls you, hey, there's a breach. What happens next? Can you work backwards from that phone call to figure out who the patient zero is on the network? And if you can't, put all of those steps together and all those pieces, well then it's likely to happen again. So another very important living, breathing document is the Incident Response Handbook. And what this does, of course, is it tells you how to handle incidents. And sometimes we'll see one. So a customer will have one, but it's old. But that's fine, right? I mean, at least it shows that someone thought about it, right? Someone thought it through and put in some time. Right? And that's a big step up from a lot of organizations. So define what the engagement process should look like, define what templates should look like, how fast things should get fixed. And then as soon as something happens, well, boom, right? You break it out. And crisis communications, this is another interesting aspect to this. Right? You look at this kind of email example, right? Jim, it looks like we might have a problem. Joe heard from Sue in app dev that some of our customer information might have been leaked. I don't know how the hell this could have happened. She posted something to the forums, giving customers a heads up. Can you believe it? Joe's freaking out a bit, but I'll have to keep him digging, says Larry, the SOC manager. And within the scope of communications, there was one interesting example that we saw where the attackers had compromised the email server, and they were actually watching the communication of the defender as they were trying to fix the network. So of course that gave the attackers a big advantage to get ahead of them. So within the scope of communications, it's a good idea to consider any kind of out of off-band communications. I believe in that particular case they ended up using WhatsApp, but of course it's just an important point. So in general, when it comes to communications, more detail of course is better, right? So providing that detail around what steps are involved. Who should be communicated with? What steps have already been taken? Which ones will be taken? Right. So this is all proper incident response communication. And of course, if you don't do this, then every executive is calling you up, or they're not properly informed when they go to the media, and it becomes problematic. So more detail is always a good thing. Now threat or risk-based monitoring. This is now this is interesting because again we see organizations again try to do too much, right? So they're trying to boil the ocean. They're trying to protect against everything because they didn't really stop and think, well, what are the threats that apply to them? And another useful exercise in this manner is to look at something like this kind of chart, and I appreciate it's going to be very difficult. Well, I think it's going to be difficult for everyone. Actually, I can't even read it from here. Well, but this is taken from the Verizon report. And so if you go and look and find that report, you'll see that you'll see this breakdown in terms of all the breaches and the incidents they analyzed, and it's broken down by vertical. So what you can do is that if you're running a hotel chain, you can look at the accommodations vertical, and then you'll see that, oh, okay, well, in terms of incidents, oh yeah, of course, point of sale systems tend to get attacked a lot. So it makes sense, right? That's a good point of reference. That's where I should start thinking about, securing my assets. So there's, this important idea of moving away from just IT risk and moving towards business risk. And again, a good thought exercise is, okay, well, there's a meteor comes down, wipes out my company or my organization. What are the first three things I'm going to do, right? And so the first thing is typically, you want everyone to be able to communicate, right? So you want to get that email server back up. The second thing comes down to what makes you money, right? So you want to sort that out. And then the third thing is customer service, both external and internal customers, right? So at the end of the day, right, you want to quickly be able to ensure that people are getting paid, customers are getting serviced, you're making money, and everyone can communicate, right? So when you're thinking about business risk, those are some of the key areas to consider, right? Protect those email servers, protect, the way that you make money, protect wherever the important information lives. So employee records, customer records, and so on. And if you're thinking, well, which applications are important? Well, you could start out with finance applications, right? So in terms of technology, now it's very hard to protect what you don't know about. So it's so much of this is about understanding your environment. And what we find is that often organizations aren't prioritizing based on risk because they don't know what they actually have out there, right? And they don't know what's important. They don't know which assets or identities are critical. And how can you actually do proper event correlation if you don't even know which data sources are available? Right? So there's which P1s are more P1 than other P1s. And if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. So again, in terms of asset visibility, there are all kinds of questions that can be asked, right? And you need to be able to answer these questions about the assets in your environment, right? So if you have a machine that's compromised, which other devices are linked to that compromised device, right? Maybe via the user. Where has that device physically gone? What does normal look like for that device? Are there other alerts out there from all of the different security systems that you have that are tied, into the immediate ecosystem of that particular asset? And the same goes for user visibility as well, right? So linking, the user, figuring out, which devices are associated with that user, where's that user based? Is that a high-risk user? Is that a very critical user? Is it the CEO? Is it some management or maybe even is it engineering? Someone with access to to important documentation or maybe source code. So this is a screenshot so this is a Splunk enterprise security view of that. But really any kind of system of record is really key. It doesn't matter how you go about tracking your assets. We often see customers start out with just spreadsheets, right? But even if you can start out with that list and create another column where you rapidly give a priority value to an asset, at least that then helps you distinguish between alerts from different assets, right? And so all of a sudden you can kind of contextualize what's happening, by doing that. And again, it goes back to cutting down on the total number of alerts. So on that topic, now machine learning, of course, hot topic, AI, yes. And I don't think this is going to replace security folk anytime soon. But what machine learning is very useful for is enhancing people and processes, right? So it can be very helpful for generating high fidelity alerts. And that's what you want at the end of the day because, again, of the resource issue. So you want to have the most high fidelity alerts possible. And when you have that, that then leads into automation, because you can be confident that, okay, what's been triggered here, this is important, I can run this playbook via automation. So machine learning can be very, very useful in dealing with those thousands and thousands of alerts. And a SOAR, or security orchestration, automation, and response, is also a very hot topic, and this is a great way of bridging that resource gap. So we often find, in terms of automation, we'll see organizations start out with, just some basic Python scripts, and then we'll see others that go full tilt into orchestration. Now automation, so a way to think about automation versus orchestration. Automation is really all about taking tasks that are easily repetitive, or that can be repeated over and over, right? So any of those kind of manual tasks that tier 1 folks are performing today, if it involves, I don't know, taking like a phishing email out of an inbox and running a reputation lookup and maybe looking up something on VirusTotal, right? All of those kinds of tasks are fairly straightforward to automate. So it's all about having this force multiplier for a team's effort, right? It's about bringing down the total amount of time that it takes to work through cases, right? So bringing down that investigation time from hours down to seconds. And then orchestration is all about coordinating complex workflows across a SOC. And then lastly here, this is something we talked about, is that with any security program, it makes sense to show value, and you can show value in different ways. Showing operational value, right? If you have these metrics in terms of the time it takes to detect and contain and close an incident, having details around the number of incidents, policy violations. Are there repeat infections, right? Offenders, vulnerability posture, right? All of these things can help show operational value, and then show strategic value, right? So if you can demonstrate what's the cost of incidents, are SLAs being met? What's the compliance status over time? And then lastly, so it was interesting again, listening to the previous talk from Telus. Where Vern there had talked about, how the different telcos are sharing information amongst themselves, right? And this is where sometimes we see organizations where they'll keep details of their security program very close to themselves. But ultimately, anytime anyone can share information, right? If we all share what works, right? What we found to be as best practices. Then that helps all of us in the industry together, right? So ultimately, the goal here is to get to that fully balanced SOC, and I hope that you found some of the content useful. If there are any questions, I won't take them now, but I'll be around afterwards. So let's do it like that. So yeah, thank you very much for coming and listening today. Hey, enjoy the rest of your day.